Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. I'm Andrew Quanbeck. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health here at UW-Madison and a part of the D&I Launchpad. And I'm honored today to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Aaron Lyon from the University of Washington, who is going to talk to us about human-centered design and implementation science. Wanted to say a few words about Aaron. We and Enola as well. Aaron and I got to know each other through the Implementation Research Institute, hosted by Washington University in St. Louis, and a great product and brainchild of Enola's work. And one of the many great things she's done in her career is created mentoring opportunities for junior faculty. And both Aaron and I have benefited greatly from that. And I think Andy is a current UW IRI attendee as well. So it's spun off into different iterations and permutations. I would encourage anyone to try to get to apply and try to get accepted. It's really tough. I had to apply 3 times to get into IRI, but I made it on the 3rd time. So it can happen. Just stay persistent. We've already talked about that a little bit. And so Aaron is going to talk to us about human-centered design and implementation science. The one thing I'll say is Aaron is a Michigan football fan, so I'm not really happy that we overlooked that in inviting him to be a part of this. And was at the last Michigan-Wisconsin game, which we won, but I don't think would happen again this year. Good luck, Aaron.
Thanks so much, Andy. I'm going to do the cool thing that I think this does, which is, ooh, look at that. So thanks, everyone. I'm Aaron Lyon, and I have the pleasure at the University of Washington. There's a lot of U's and W's in the room here today, of course, locally, and then with Enola and myself. I have the pleasure at the University of Washington to co-direct the UW Alacrity Center, which is really dedicated to the intersection of implementation science and human-centered design. And there I co-lead with Sean Munson and Pat Arian. And I also co-direct the SMART Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, which I lead along with folks like Jill Locke and Eric Bruns. And I also have the pleasure of directing what was really inspired by IRI, the Research Institute for Implementation Science and Education. And what I'll be talking about most here today is most directly relevant to the work that we do at the UW Alacrity Center that sort of elevates human-centered design kind of at every turn. But it's not necessarily just limited to that. But our work at the Alacrity Center is really dedicated to the notion that we can do adaptation better, adaptation of complex interventions, which may be client or patient-facing interventions, and may be some of our complex, largely psychosocial implementation strategies that we've already been talking some about. So I'll be talking about how human-centered design aligns with and can augment implementation science, and how there can be some cross-pollination. I know that a lot of people, when they hear something like human-centered design, they think digital. And that's part of what I'll be talking about, but that's only one part and only one particular domain of application for human-centered design principles and methods. A couple of acknowledgements, the P50 that funds our UW Alacrity Center, and then some other grants that are relevant to some of the work that I'll be talking about today, both from NIMH and from the Institute of Education Sciences. So I'd like to begin with my last points. And those are that the world is designed and can be better designed. That human-centered design and implementation science have overlapping objectives, but somewhat different foci. And that there are opportunities to better integrate human-centered design and implementation science to enhance impact. And, like all good domains of science, some things left to figure out. First, I want to start with the fact that design problems are everywhere. If you encounter something as simple as a door and you need a sign to tell you how to use it, that might not be the best designed door. This is just a classic example that a lot of people in the design space love to trot out. Taking your eyes off the road too long or too often could cause a crash, resulting in your injury or death for you or others. Focus your attention on driving, and hopefully by the time you've finished reading this, you're still alive. In another classic example, it's a well-known fact that you must spin a USB 3 times before it fits. Therefore, we can deduce that the USB has 3 states: the up position, the down position, and the superposition. And it will remain in the superposition until observed, except in cases of USB tunneling. Another classic example of problematic design, less relevant now that we have USB-C. So we're always getting better. This is sort of my "a rose by any other name would smell as sweet" slide. And these are listed in no particular order. As with implementation science, where we have implementation science and knowledge translation and knowledge utilization and scaling science in different ways to describe related, in many ways overlapping activities, human-centered design has this. I tend to use the term human-centered design, but there's co-design, user interface, human-computer interaction, user experience, design thinking, user-centered design, human factors engineering, and this isn't a comprehensive list. There are some people who will argue vehemently about which of these terms and which of these conceptualizations sits on top and is the largest umbrella term. I am not one of those people. So human-centered design, this is just sort of a generic human-centered design schematic sort of process framework. Human-centered design is an approach that grounds the product development process in information about the people and settings who will use that product. This generic framework has identifying the needs and planning the human-centered design process, moving into understanding and specifying your context of use, specifying user needs and user and contextual requirements, developing your design solutions to meet those needs, and evaluating how well you did it, and doing that iteratively until you've adequately met your user needs and your contextual requirements. And this human-centered design as a whole is really based on building understanding and empathy for the people in the real world who are ultimately going to be using whatever the thing is, whether it's the thing or whether it's the thing that you have to help to do the thing in implementation strategy. So human-centered design and implementation science share a lot of common objectives. They're both interested in the adoption of new innovations. They both focus really, to one extent or another, on iteratively solving real-world problems. And they're both focused on multiple stakeholders and ultimately on individual behavior. But they also have some differences. Human-centered design changes the innovation to meet local needs. And although implementation science, I think, is increasingly oriented toward that and the science of adaptation, historically, implementation science has been very focused on emphasizing innovation fidelity above all else. And I think that we've sort of eased off on that and understood, that adaptation is frequently required when implementing. Human-centered design evaluates, but aside from some corners of the design world, is less focused often on changing the setting itself. Whereas in implementation science, we often have strategies that seek to change the organizational setting, to improve organizational climate or culture. But I do want to note that systems engineering and service design is sort of one exception that sits down here. Edmund, I see you cheering. I added this after you sent me that paper. I added this. You're welcome. This is the points from that last slide are essentially the points that were made in this paper, this useful paper from 2020, with implementation science contributing broad multi-level frameworks and human-centered design contributing specific user-focused methods, all in service of population health impact. This is a useful paper led by Alex Dopp that detailed 30 human-centered design strategies that could be relevant to people working in the implementation space. These human-centered design strategies covered different system levels, but were most likely to attend to the innovation level more than our standard implementation strategies, which are much less likely to be focused on the innovation itself and ways that you might be able to do things with that innovation, the thing, in order to make it more implementable. So these human-centered design techniques can be placed along a continuum, I would say, which I have done in this slide. You'll see in a moment in a completely non-scientific way, but based on my opinion. Most of these techniques are drawn from the work of Alex Dopp in that paper I was talking about. Because human-centered design techniques and strategies really range from those that are primarily focused on information gathering and generating ideas to those that are focused on the process of putting what you know or what you think you know into practice. So this includes things like field observations, observing the settings in which an innovation is going to be used to gather information about the everyday activities and environments and interactions, et cetera, happening in that setting. User interviews, conducting individual interviews that are designed to gather information about the preferences and priorities of potential users. Co-creation sessions. Co-creation can mean many different things. I feel like that's really, in a lot of ways, an umbrella term that may mean lots of different things in different settings. But these could involve convening potential users from the community that you're serving to have them design an innovation prototype alongside you. More in the sort of design end of the spectrum. Live prototyping, providing a functional prototype of an innovation to potential users and collecting feedback as they attempt to use the prototype. And then just this notion of iterative development over time, this progressive refinement of the thing that you're designing. And those are, of course, just a few in the broad array, and again, non-comprehensive array of techniques and strategies that might be used in the human-centered design space. So how well integrated are these two things? Implementation science, human-centered design. Alex Dopp led a study, an online study of human-centered design and implementation experts, just a subset of them, of course, 20 to 30 of each, and completed a concept mapping task of human-centered design strategies and implementation strategies, a subset of the compilation of implementation strategies, the ERIC compilation that a few people, anyone ever heard of the ERIC compilation, expert recommendations for implementing change, a leading compilation of implementation strategies. Anyway, put these into the same survey in order to identify how these things are clustering. So how well integrated are they, at least with regard to the strategies that they're using, to try to demonstrate the degree of alignment across these core practices? And the answer is not particularly. We have 5 implementation-only clusters, 2 human-centered design-only clusters, those are on the bottom right, and 3 transdisciplinary clusters, right? So 3 of the 10 strategy clusters were sort of transdisciplinary. So depending on how you look at it, these could be great sort of points of intersection to elevate in collaborations, or we might focus other places because there's already some alignment there. And why focus on that when we could potentially build even more opportunities for collaboration in different sorts of zones? But those were promote leadership and collaboration, co-design solutions, and understand systems and context. So plenty of integration work to do. Human-centered design targets and implementation tend to include one of 3 things. And they can be applied to a wide range of health services research products. That's in this paper, that's sort of how we described these main sort of 3 buckets of things that could be the focus of design, right? There's the evidence-based psychosocial interventions, especially in the mental health space. We have a lot of psychosocial interventions, psychotherapies and interventions like that tend to be pretty complex, socially mediated processes. Things like parent training protocols or cognitive behavioral therapy and the like. We also have digital technologies, which are what they sound like, might be devices or wearables or apps or websites or things like that, decision support tools, as well as implementation strategies, right? Those methods or techniques to enhance implementation outcomes primarily. Training, post-training consultation, leadership-oriented strategies and things like that. I'll note again here that systems and organizations can also be designed, but that in implementation science, they're often redesigned as the result of the application of an implementation strategy. Systematic and narrative reviews suggest that in health and in education, non-digital approaches are rare. So a lot of the work, explicit work with human-centered design, sort of sits there focusing on the digital space. So I'm going to try, to the best of my ability, to talk about not that. So when we're talking about interventions and we're talking about implementation strategies, I think it's safe to say that interventions and strategies may be over-designed in some situations for performance in research and simultaneously under-designed for addressing the needs and constraints of routine service contexts. So over-design, they may be complicated and infeasible in the real world. They may often require replacement of existing practices rather than augmentation of existing practices, this sort of replacement paradigm. Stop doing that, start doing what we tell you. Under-design may be inflexible, or at least perceived to be inflexible, and even that perception is likely the result of a design flaw. And inadequately responsive to novel contexts. And the reason this matters is because problematic design limits scalability. It's going to limit public health impact, and we know that the public health impact of evidence-based psychosocial interventions, at least within mental health, continues to be limited by inconsistent application. I think we can probably make a blanket statement across all of health and even beyond. Implementation science, of course, the study of methods to promote systematic uptake of research findings. And what I would argue is that intervention and implementation strategy design is an underappreciated determinant. By determinant, that's kind of implementation speak for barrier or facilitator, an underappreciated determinant surrounding adoption and use. I like this quote from a paper of Greg Ahrens a number of years back. For all types of scaling out, it may be possible to use the identical evidence-based intervention. However, we more often need to adapt the intervention to fit the new population and or delivery setting, right? And this was in a paper where Greg Ahrens was talking about the notion of scaling out, a deliberate attempt to broaden the delivery of an evidence-based intervention to sort of new settings and new contexts, which is, of course, placed along a continuum in terms of the degree of similarity between where something may have originally been developed and where you're trying to implement it now. And so we have this emerging science of adaptation within the implementation space. I think that this is depicted pretty well in one of our classic implementation frameworks, the CFR, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, that clearly shows in the figure here that we have an intervention, unadapted, and then we have an adapted intervention sort of on the other side. And this really underscores the notion that there is no implementation without adaptation. Adaptation isn't a good thing or a bad thing, it happens. And there's ways to do it that make it more of a good thing, I might say. So adaptation is also critical when we're talking about service access. There's low availability of evidence-based interventions in a lot of community settings, and that's frequently due to intervention complexity and low contextual fit. In mental health, this is really true in non-specialty service settings where marginalized or minoritized communities may be most likely to receive care. I do a lot of my work in schools. And schools are actually, in a way, a great equalizer in terms of service access for historically underserved children and families. And so I think there's that much more of an imperative to come into those settings and see how you can deliver accessible and effective services and leverage that kind of service access that seems to be relatively inherent in the system. And adaptations may be proactive, and they may be sort of done ahead of time and thoughtfully in preparation for an implementation effort, or they may also be reactive, meaning that in the context of implementation or rollout or delivery of an intervention, that adaptation happens. I think it's usually posited that proactive adaptations are going to be more beneficial ultimately, maybe more fidelity consistent and things like that. Although I haven't actually seen that many studies that have dug into this. So I think some of that remains a bit of an open question. In the UW Alacrity Center, we have a framework here that we sort of think of as integrating human-centered design and implementation science, the DDBT, or Discover, Design, Build, Test framework. And this is really just sort of a more specific representation of the generic human-centered design framework I was showing you before. So we begin with our discover phase. This is our sort of information gathering phase, where we're really trying to learn about three different things: the setting, the people in that setting, and the thing that's going to be implemented, or the strategy that's going to be used to implement something. And that's where we're identifying things like usability issues with the strategy or with the intervention. I'll talk a little bit more about those. And then we have our iterative design build process, where we're seeing how well we can sort of hit those contextual and user requirements. And then we have a test phase, which we really think about as a small scale kind of pilot hybrid effectiveness implementation trial, where we're looking at implementation outcomes with our sort of high fidelity prototypes. And when I talk about high fidelity prototypes, I'm talking about fidelity as it's really conceptualized and used as a term within the design space, which is different from how we use it in implementation. With implementation, it's use as intended, right? But within the design space, it's sort of degree of doneness, let's call it, and how ready it is for prime time. So we move through these. This is currently being applied in 15 different UW Alacrity studies to redesign both interventions and implementation strategies, including those with and without a digital component. Some of these are technology-enabled services, I would argue, that have a human component in terms of the delivery of a psychotherapy that may be augmented by a digital tool in some ways, and some are just purely psychosocial processes. I want to make a quick note about digital redesign. Again, because I think it's easy to sort of equate human-centered design and digital, and I don't think we need to. Digital redesign of interventions or turning them into more technology-enabled services, whether you're in mental health or any other space, is great and can be very useful, especially when it's solving a particular problem. It can improve the scale and accessibility for some, but it can also, and I think it's important for us to recognize that it can also limit the accessibility for other populations. And intervention technologies, let's just make sure we recognize, tend to suffer from the same adoption and sustainment problems as more traditional interventions. And there have been some reviews documenting that as well. But this isn't an either-or decision. And like I said, at the UW Alacrity Center, we use plenty of digital redesign solutions. I think maybe 2/3 have some digital component. But again, we try to avoid defaulting to digital solutions. Now I want to move on to the notion of usability, which is sort of a core component, let's say, or a core construct within human-centered design. And usability is the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals in a specified context of use. And I would argue that usability's importance increases with scale. When you start off and you have a few highly motivated users of something, they can work around a lot of things. Like this was certainly true in the early days of computing, when Bill Gates and people who were really motivated to learn a lot about computers that really, let's be honest, were terrible to use. And you had to know a lot of things, at steep learning curve. But they had the motivation to go out there and do that. And I think that's true a lot of the time when we're developing new interventions, and maybe they're being developed in an academic setting. Maybe there are highly motivated and really competent graduate students who are first in charge of using this. And in those sorts of situations, your users can be pretty robust to problematic design. But with greater scale, usability's importance increases pretty rapidly. This is a sort of a theoretical relationship. This is not a data-driven relationship here. I wanted to just make that clear. But I think it's likely to hold true. Another theoretical and not data-driven relationship is between usability and other implementation outcomes. We often think about usability as a little bit more of a determinant, a barrier or facilitator, than an implementation outcome. But this is ultimately an empirical question, how these constructs relate. I mean, it's also true, an empirical question, the extent to which acceptability, feasibility, and appropriateness are parts of a whole, are sort of well-differentiated constructs. But this is just the way that we've been thinking about it most recently, with usability being more a property of the innovation itself, but of course a property of the innovation itself that emerges in different ways when it intersects with context. Thinking about usability as a determinant, you could consider it being perhaps most proximal to things that I might label perceptual implementation outcomes, things that don't necessarily have to be, but are very often evaluated as perceptions, people's self-report of their perceptions related to acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility. And perhaps through that, impacting behavioral implementation outcomes, things you can see, right? Things you can measure by watching, adoption, fidelity, reach, or penetration. And then ultimately, of course, in service of the service outcomes, which are the whole reason we're doing all this. And then conversely, implementation outcomes can be theorized to be key proximal effects of good design. So when we talk about usability and how we're going to measure it, I start thinking and talking to all of you about usability testing. And there are some best practices for usability testing involving identifying end users, sort of your primary, secondary, and even negative users. And there's an activity later where you'll all be able to do that for particular projects. Primary users are the people whose needs you need to meet. Secondary users are other people who might sort of interact with a thing, and you can meet their needs as long as it doesn't compromise your ability to meet the needs of your primary users. And negative or non-users are the people you're not designing for, because if you're designing for everyone, you're designing for no one. There's prioritizing components for testing, because it's often very difficult to test the entirety of a complex thing. It's just like if you're doing user testing of the Windows operating system. You're not going to test every last function, because that would take a year. Test authentic versus ideal circumstances in order to really understand how it's going to be carried out in the real world. Create opportunities for users to actually interact with components versus just asking them what they think about it. So this may be task or scenario driven. Tracking success, failure, or efficiency in completing those tasks, and qualitatively describing usability issues that users might encounter. And I just have this note here that focus groups are not usability testing. Focus groups are great and have so many different purposes, but they're not usability testing when they're just asking for people's sort of perceptions or thoughts about something. There could be group-based ways to do user testing where there might be the introduction of actual sort of tasks or scenarios, but that's not typically how we do our focus groups. Another note on user identification. I'd like you all to say this with me. The user is not like me. Thank you. That was good. And this is important because the identification of end users is a key aspect of articulating preconditions to sort of when an intervention or implementation strategy might be relevant. We also know that product developers of all sorts tend to underestimate user diversity in their design processes. And as a result, and this is an easy thing for us all to do, base their designs on people similar to themselves. And that may be okay, but it sure depends on who's in the room doing the designing. And that the identification of representative users and user needs can help to correct this bias. So user identification is sort of a key piece of a human-centered design process, and especially a usability testing process. And again, you're going to have an opportunity in small groups to identify users and different sort of potential subgroups of users and think about why it matters when thinking through primary users, secondary users, and non-users. But one of the reasons we do this, and one of the reasons within human-centered design we try to think so much about who our users are, is because of that sort of goal and value placed on developing empathy for users, ultimately perhaps developing personas, sort of these like archetypes of users that are data-driven, and to be able to ultimately be as responsive as possible in designs. I work in schools, I work a lot with kids and families, and youth-oriented users or services are likely to have a larger set of primary users as a function of youth and caregivers, in addition to other important adult involvement. And the clear articulation of users can be one strategy for building more equitable health services research products. But that doesn't mean it's going to get you there on its own. I want to talk just a little bit about different usability evaluation methods. And again, this is non-comprehensive, but these are in increasing order of cost, I would say, when you want to evaluate the usability of something. You can use quantitative instruments. If you're evaluating a digital tool, you could use the system usability scale. It's been widely used for decades. There's good normative data surrounding it. And that can really tell you how significant overall are an innovation's usability issues. You can use heuristic evaluation, which is really having experts with design knowledge come in and evaluate how well an innovation of some sort aligns with established usability principles. You can do cognitive walkthroughs, which allow you to look at things like how the basic structure and process of an innovation aligns with users' internal mental models for how things should go. You can do sort of lab-based usability testing where you bring people in and have them talk about and have them experience and complete tasks and within scenarios to identify what specific usability issues people encounter when completing those tasks. And then there's in vivo testing, which really involves a certain amount of deployment or implementation in order to do real-world testing, where then you can look at what aspects of an innovation may be most related to its adoption or discontinuation in the real world. Another thing you can do in vivo testing, I think, is take something like fidelity and fidelity assessment and flip it on its head. And think to yourself, instead of how do we get them to maximize their fidelity, use fidelity as an opportunity to evaluate what components of an innovation aren't working for the users. So one of the things we try to do with usability testing is identify usability issues. These are aspects of an innovation or demands on users that make it unpleasant, inefficient, onerous, or impossible for the user to achieve their goals. At the UW Alacrity Center, and borrowing heavily from what's already in the human-centered design literature, we have laid out some components of usability issues. The first is just sort of like a qualitative description or problem statement. And from problem statements, we hope that the reader of that problem statement could understand when the problem occurs, what components of the intervention the problem occurs during, for what users the problem occurs, what the problem is, and what the consequences of the problem might be. We also have ratings of severity, ranging from totally catastrophic to just a subtle problem that might be annoying every now and again. The scope, how often does it happen, how sort of frequently within the intervention, or across how many different sort of users or subtypes of users does this problem occur. Complexity, do we even understand this problem enough to know what a fix might be? And then evidence, what evidence supports the above components. This is what in the UW Alacrity Center, we ask all of our projects to use as sort of a common framework for reporting their usability issues to us. This just so far shows the usability issues that we've gotten from our different teams. So far, we've gotten 72 discrete intervention or implementation strategy usability issues. This is from just 10 of our 15 studies. Just an example of one of these. This is a project done by Karen Bears and Jill Locke that was redesigning an intervention, a behavioral intervention for youth with autism spectrum disorders, and redesigning it for use by teachers in schools. So this is just one of the usability issues that they identified, that they articulated as individualized visual supports, which is a core component of Ruby, that's the name of the intervention, require a lot of time to develop. Okay, they categorize this as a level 2, creates significant delay and frustration. The scope was that 7 out of their 8 participants experienced this issue. Relatively low complexity because they had a solution, could be addressed via a template for individualized visual supports. And they had evidence from their in-class observations of Ruby's users, as well as from semi-structured interviews. Based on what we've gathered at the UW Alacrity Center surrounding usability issues, we actually came up with 12 different categories that then we've turned into, and I'll show you on the next slide, a set of design heuristics. The first is cognitively or complex or cognitively overwhelming. This was our most common category, that the intervention or implementation strategy is too overwhelming to the user or the interventionist in the case of an implementation strategy where one of the users might be an implementation practitioner, right? Someone who's delivering a training, someone who's delivering consultation or something like that. Two, that the time required exceeded the time available within the setting where they could do that. The third is incompatibility with interventionist preferences or practices, incompatibility with existing workflows, insufficient customization, problematic intervention buy-in related to the value placed on it. And by that, I sort of mean like that the intervention or strategy doesn't sufficiently build client or recipient, in the case of an implementation strategy, buy-in related to that it is valuable. There's also the buy-in related to trust, that the intervention or implementation strategy doesn't build the trust in the interventionist, right? The individual who's going to be delivering it. Over-reliance on technology. This is just an interesting one, that the intervention or implementation strategy assumes the presence of or the feasibility of some technology, usually digital technology, that creates barriers for some providers or recipients that is not easily overcome. Requires unavailable infrastructure. So this is a non-technology one, but in a way it's somewhat related, that it might make assumptions about what's present in the system that would be needed in order to deliver it. There was one example about this from a project that was in schools. And in schools, there's something called multi-tiered systems of support, which is really a sort of a tiered service delivery framework, very similar to the public health model, with like universal primary prevention, working your way up to more indicated services. And this intervention sort of made an assumption that there was already this multi-level framework in place. And in the absence of that, you have a usability issue for the innovation that required the system to already be on board with that. So inadequate scaffolding, inadequate training and these are different for the sort of recipient versus the deliverer of the intervention or implementation strategy, and lack of support for necessary communication. So then we took these and we developed a set of proposed, I'm sure we'll be refining as we go forward, but proposed design heuristics. And heuristics are really guiding principles for evaluating whether products are usable, and something people can sort of keep in their mind and apply as they're reviewing something, if they're doing something perhaps like heuristic evaluation that I was talking about earlier. So these include things like low cognitive load, efficient use of time, responsive to existing practices as well as existing system constraints, flexible and adaptable, demonstrates value, builds satisfaction and trust, avoids technology choices that can exclude people or settings, requires minimal infrastructure, is learnable for recipients and for the interventionists, and enhances communication and feedback. So you see how some of these are simply flipped from the usability issue, and some of them are a little more nuanced and a little bit and tailored a little bit beyond that. So now I want to talk about, in the remaining time I have up here, a few persistent tensions that I've noticed in human-centered design. And I think to some extent, these are probably tensions that are present in implementation science as well. And I'm also sure these aren't the only tensions. These are just ones that I've observed. And the first is this notion of universality versus context dependence of design solutions. And how attainable is this notion of universal design? This notion that some design features or some design decisions can be applicable across all groups of humans. And I think that we have a lot of that tension also reflected in implementation science related to implementation strategies and tailoring of implementation strategies and degree of tailoring required of different implementation strategies. And in a lot of ways, this is also the classic tension between internal and external validity. Is more engagement with a product always better? I think for a long time, thinking of engagement as something that's quantitative and something that we should pursue as much of as possible has been sort of like a prevailing approach within human-centered design. Let's get people looking at their apps more, spending more time here. But there's now sort of a growing amount of thinking about engagement as sort of like how high quality is engagement versus just lots of engagement, and how sort of fully engaged and beneficial are those points of contact with whatever the thing is that's being designed. How much influence do users have in ultimate design decisions? We definitely need to balance and somehow sort of combine in optimal ways users' knowledge and ideas with designers' knowledge and expertise and sort of methodological process expertise, right? But of course, users continue to be the best experts on themselves, their settings, and their own experiences. And design is often participatory. And I think human-centered design does a fairly good job of using a lot of engaging and participatory methods. But in my experience, and there are exceptions to this, of course, but human-centered design stops short of doing what I would consider to be full community-based participatory research, where there's shared power and decision-making at every step along the way. That's typically not how it winds up manifesting itself. And can human-centered design help to improve health equity with its existing power structures and things like that? Can it help improve health equity? Maybe. But it's important to recognize that, of course, inequities in healthcare often occur as a result of inadequate understanding and incorporation of user needs. Okay, so there's maybe one inroad there. And a core principle of human-centered design is that stakeholders are in the best position to communicate their needs. And there are different ways to identify users and involve users and elevate user voice in order to do that. Okay, so that could help. An early contextual inquiry can help avoid equity-related pitfalls by surfacing information about the destination setting or needs, and can serve as the foundation for local innovation. Okay. There's newer methods such as remote approaches that allow for geographically distant and asynchronous co-design among different collaborators, be them intergenerational or geographically dispersed. Or there's also opportunities and sort of methods that are used surrounding participatory design in virtual game environments that may be familiar to youth and can elevate their voice and engagement. Many people are doing things like hosting design groups in community spaces like local libraries to engage families from underrepresented populations. So there's some potential there. So that's good. And human-centered design can support equity goals by improving the contextual appropriateness and cultural responsiveness of innovations, which can be an explicit objective and an explicit sort of design constraint. So that's good too. But I would say that human-centered design can only help improve health equity with some re-examination. This is a relatively long quote from a paper just from this year. Despite human-centered design's framing as a collaborative approach with end users, power structures are insidious to its practice history. Indeed, the potential for the development of the following power structure is rampant in human-centered design. A designer, often a cisgender, heterosexual white male, I reflect this, attempting to uncover the needs of a marginalized user and or community to create a product. Marginalized users and communities may often already have strong notions of what might work for them and do not need these ideas to be uncovered for them. We cannot promote this group of human-centered design approaches as a means to promote equity in interventions without explicitly acknowledging that it has historically not been used for this in this way and will not be used for equity without purposeful and continued scrutiny of its practice. So I'll leave you with that and with the main points from the beginning revisited, that the world is designed and can be better designed, that human-centered design and implementation science have overlapping objectives but different foci, and that there are opportunities to better integrate the two, and plenty of things left to figure out. Thank you. Is this working?
Yeah, so we have some time for Q&A from the audience. So what questions do you have for Dr. Lyon?
Well, I have a couple of questions, but I'll just start with one now. It's so important to have all these heuristics for meeting usability. And the research field, well, there's this tension between you have to show effectiveness and yet at the same time, the more you try to make it usable, the less you might strip away key elements and make it not very effective. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
I think that's definitely a tension here. And I would also argue sort of I don't know if it's the reverse of that, but a different version of that in pursuit of larger and larger effect sizes, we've layered on more and more complexity as we go, right? There's an intervention that I've actually been trained in, delivered parent-child interaction therapy for disruptive behavior problems. And there are projects where it's, well, let's take parent-child interaction therapy and add an additional parent engagement component. And then we're adding maybe a teacher adjunctive component and doing all these different things that ultimately end up creating something that's less implementable than it once was. So I do think that there's sort of just like a lot of back and forth needed between, okay, what are the effect sizes we're looking for and how are we going to get there? What don't we need? Because I think that in most of our interventions, we have more things that we don't need than we are aware of. Like our notion, even the notion of core components and adaptable periphery is rarely something that is empirically driven. It may be theoretically driven, it may be simply driven by the perspective of a developer, but there's often more, more sort of stock and chaff separation that can be done related to both our interventions and our implementation strategies. And I think that doing more of that. And of course, you can't do sort of the nearly endless set of unpacking studies that you would need to do to fully know that, right? So it's always going to be somewhat out of reach. But I think bringing in the perspective of how can we make this as streamlined as possible, and recognize that sometimes even losing some of your effect size is okay if you can increase the scope of its delivery. And one more thing, as we're redesigning things, I think it's that much more important to be able to understand and evaluate the proximal mechanisms of our interventions, which can give you earlier signals about what components of your intervention may be most effective for whatever the core mechanisms could be. Like, for example, I've done a lot of work with different types of cognitive behavioral therapies, right? Leading cognitive intervention, especially for depression, anxiety, and things like that. And one of the things that's sort of theorized, and there's empirical support for it too, for cognitive behavioral therapies, is sort of shifting negative automatic thoughts. And that could be that's a mechanism through which the delivery of cognitive behavioral therapy could actually improve symptoms of depression. And understanding those and those sort of key mechanisms of action for interventions can also lead the way to things that might be less critical in order to get there.
Amazing talk. I really love what you ended on, that powerful notion that there needs to be a reckoning, a re-examining of the roots. And it mirrors the reckoning that has been happening in anthropology when you look at the colonial and imperialistic roots of methods like ethnography. And there are lots of layers. It's very complex. It takes a lot of vulnerability and courage, and it takes time. So you shine the spotlight on it from a human-centered design perspective and implementation science for equity as far as the problem is concerned. Do you have any notions on what we need to do to solve? You took ownership of your own limitations, as many of us have. We're not like our users, and so what are your thoughts on strategies to address this?
I mean, ultimately, I think there's no replacement for representation, right? Whether it's representation on design teams or whether it's representation, within the field, and there's not necessarily any easy ways to get there other than continued attention over. I mean, maybe it's a little bit easier to ensure some representation on design teams and building more diverse design teams. And there's evidence to suggest that more diverse design teams create more solutions and better solutions than more homogeneous design teams. So I think that's something that could be a bit of a shorter term solution. But ultimately, I think it's about improving both in implementation science and in human-centered design, and frankly, in probably most of our professions, more representation and more diversity, which, of course, will take decades.
Just speaking to Edmund's point, there are really interesting things coming out of liberatory design, design for equity, equity by design. And one of them is this concept of equity designers are those with lived experience of the issue at hand. Design allies are those who use their resources, skills, and knowledge to support equity designers. So it's a sort of a humbling switch of who's in the driver's seat.
Thanks so much for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Such a well-designed PowerPoint presentation. I really appreciated the usability rubric that you've put together and are utilizing in your center. And I had two questions related to that. The first is, and motivated, I work in refugee mental health services work, and wondered to what extent you feel like that usability framework is really elevating issues that relate to adapting interventions with culturally distinct groups. And then I think more broadly, I was wondering your thoughts about, it seems like such a useful rubric for adaptation of interventions, which has typically been under the umbrella of implementation science. So wonder what your thinking is about the role or the overlap there and the potential.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, at the UW Alacrity Center, those usability issues are the primary drivers of redesign solutions. And we've made that pretty explicit. We're also gathering, actually using Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman's frame, the framework for adaptations and modifications of evidence-based interventions. We're gathering information about how they're being adapted and linking those to the usability issues that different teams have presented to us so that we can have this crosswalk of the most common and the ones that seem to be most effective redesign solutions based on those usability issues. So we consider those to be sort of like the primary, engines of what teams do subsequently in order to ensure like a more usable and more implementable thing.
So I wanted to ask about one other area, which is I feel like sometimes that frequently the decision makers, the adopters, whether it's school principals or the school board, they may not have the same sort of things that they think about with adoption as are important to the interventionists and the end users. So part of my question is, well, when do you bring in the adopters' viewpoints, and how do you design within that tension?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good question, and definitely attention. We often consider those kinds of system-level decision makers who might not interact directly with whatever you're implementing or redesigning to be secondary users, to be sort of key secondary users whose opinions and perspectives can be incorporated sort of through various HCD processes, recognizing that they're probably going to have pretty different needs. So then the issue winds up, if you're, say, redesigning something to implement, that then the issue might be how to reconcile divergent needs, or what to do or how to redesign when you need to constantly be working against scope creep. Because I feel like every time you get another users or user groups input into something, there's always that potential and that pitfall for something to get more complex. Because the easiest way, usually in my experience, sort of talking to different teams, to try to address some issue that some group has tends to be to add something. And like that's a problematic trap to fall into. So I don't know if I have any sort of really great or always generalizable suggestions for how to design something that's going to be very sort of approachable and acceptable for those decision makers. But that could be one pathway to it. Now, of course, redesigning an intervention is just one implementation strategy, likely in a multifaceted implementation approach that you're going to take. And there could be plenty of opportunity to bring in more of a system level or organizationally focused implementation strategy to address like those particular individuals, recognizing that they may be the ones that are making sort of the critical adoption decisions for a system, whether it's a school system or another kind of system. And that could be something that could be done in parallel to an intervention adaptation process. So you have really a multi-level implementation approach where there's some that's focused on that leadership, but then you also have, what I might categorize as, an intervention-focused implementation strategy, which is sometimes how we describe that kind of strategic redesign.
I was wondering about the skills required for implementation and driving it, and also, for example, persuasion and mindset shifts, if that's a component. One, in the sense, from the side of the person who's initiating the intervention, but the other, or implementation, and the other is from an organization which wants to adopt, but there are early adopters, there are laggards, and so you have there's some element of translating that. So I was wondering if you could speak to the skills required.
And I guess there's the overlapping but distinct skills for implementation, perhaps, and then for design processes, which are not necessarily the same. I mean, there's some, and I think that the sort of willingness and perhaps eagerness for iteration and failing fast is probably a skill and a mindset that's very useful in both implementation and human-centered design. But related to sort of organizational shifts and how those kind of, are sort of simultaneously the composite of individual people's perceptions and sort of willingness to do things, and at the same time they are kind of a result or downstream consequence of shifting organizational norms and climate. I mean, that's something that of course can be explicitly targeted by some implementation strategies to try to create a more conducive climate, where it's clear that implementation of particular evidence-based practices is expected and rewarded and supported. That kind of being the common way that implementation climate winds up getting described. So I don't know, did I answer your question, or I feel like I may have missed at least like one piece of it there. I want to make sure.
Yeah, you did answer part of it in terms of the iterative nature and of approaching it. But I was wondering also in terms of skills and skills training that is needed to be imparted. So if an organization wants to implement something and you're making a usable product, but there's some element of persuasion and mindset shift that's also required. And I was wondering how that can be passed on, trained.
I mean, I think partially, at least for implementation, and this may not be quite as true for human-centered design, that there's a certain amount of just sort of like social fluidity that helps. Now, the extent to which that can be trained, or the extent to which that is simply something that has sort of, people have self-selected into implementation, I think it's a pretty important component. Now, of course, there's more sort of concrete skills, like the identification of implementation kind of barriers and facilitators, and then the process of matching those to particular implementation strategies. That's, I think, an easier thing to kind of train people on and put together worksheets surrounding and all kinds of things like that. But like so many things, and this is also true within psychotherapy and mental health, where there's certain sort of, let's call them soft skills and relationship building and ability to connect with people socially and that kind of thing that winds up making everything a much smoother process. And when you can build sort of specific concrete skills on top of that, then I think you're most likely to be successful.
Yeah. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. I really appreciated your comfort with the overlap and the different terms that can be used in design space. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how we can get some of these silos that exist, so human factors engineering, design thinking, to share their methods that might benefit in other areas or in implementation science.
I mean, and siloing between like implementation science and human-centered design. And I mean, I think a lot of it just comes down to having ambassadors come and talk about it, and creating opportunities for people to sort of come together, whether it's during, meetings that might cater to one group or another. Prior to the CIRC conference, the Society for Implementation Research Collaboration, we had a pre-conference meeting that was really focused on the intersection between HCD and implementation science. We just proposed another one for the CHI conference, which is like a leading human-centered design conference. Again, trying to do that, but of course with a somewhat different audience. There might be some overlap, but just to create sort of more opportunities for interaction for everyone to sort of realize that they're talking about some pretty similar things, but that sometimes they're not talking about the same things, and that's also very useful, right? And so in a way, it's like you can't lose, because you're getting people together to either realize that they're talking about a lot of the same stuff, or to sort of figure out that there's opportunities to augment what they're doing or to do things differently, and kind of seek inspiration from other people who have the same ultimate objective.
Time for one more question.
Hi there. I had a question about your Discover, Design, Build, Test framework. When initially I read about it and looked at your slide when you were speaking, it kind of reminded me of Gina Wingood's Adapt It model. And so I was wondering if you could kind of, not compare and contrast, but just, to me, I was like, okay, now when do I use this versus when do I use that? Because they kind of parallel in some capacity. And so just was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
And I don't know that model inside and out enough to fully compare and contrast, but I mean, I think the easy answer to that question is when it makes sense to you, right? And when it seems to really fit your purposes and the objectives of a particular process or a particular project. I mean, I was also involved in the development of a similar model called the ACTS framework, ACTS, Accelerated Creation to Sustainment. That model, which we published in Journal of Medical Internet Research, I believe, is focused pretty explicitly on technology-enabled services, and is sort of geared towards simultaneously developing both sort of a human service component and a digital technology component. So if that's the sort of situation, that's just an example of how I might pick one versus another in order to align with the needs of a particular project. But there's nothing special about the DDBT framework. And it itself is just a sort of more, like I was saying, specific articulation of a generic human-centered design framework, which itself shares a lot of commonalities with PDSA cycles and things like that. So we're all kind of in orbit around a lot of the same types of processes and ideas and values and ultimately goals. And there's just different ways to get there.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Lyon, for that talk. I'm going to pass it back over to Felice